As we approach the end of the 20th century in an era of high-tech communications, aerospace, satellites, exploration of outer space, and automated assembly lines, America's first important industry has been relegated to a position of minor importance, as wood has been replaced by other building materials. During the 19th century, the timbering industry flourished across the northeastern portion of the United States, from Maine to Minnesota. The wood most sought after, especially by English shipbuilders, was white pine. The trees grew straight and tall, often as high as 170 feet, much treasured as sail ship masts. White pine has straight-grained soft wood with little resin and is now used especially for interior and cabinet work. During the 1800s and the early part of this century, white pine was the most sought-after timber in much of the world. It was easy to cut and nail, and the wood was strong and light in weight and color. As early as the late 16th century, colonists in New England and the Jamestown settlement of Virginia were supplying timber to England, where the forest had all but disappeared. It was because of this shortfall of timber that the English decided to establish colonies in North America with its hundreds of millions of pine and hardwood trees along the Atlantic coast. The major exportable merchandise which was able to sustain the colonies was timber. When the King of England's governors attempted to take the best timbers of the forest for his Royal Navy, the woodsmen rebelled. These timbermen of New England set fire to thousands of acres of trees, which the king demanded for his shipbuilders. So this act of defiance was, for all intents, a declaration of war by the woodsmen. Soon after came the rebellion against prohibitive new taxes, which resulted in the now historic Boston Tea Party, when lumbermen and farmers threw highly taxed British tea into Boston Harbor, which in turn led to the start of the American Revolution against the British Crown in 1776. After the colonies won their independence, lumbering became the first important business, a growing industry employing thousands of workers in forests and hundreds of water-powered lumber mills, preparing the valuable timber for export to Europe, which was now dependent for much of its wood, much the same as America now depends on the Mideast for its oil. By the 1800s, lumbermen were sending loggers into the forest for months at a time. The cutting and transporting of the trees was done during the winter months, as snow was necessary for the sleighs that carried the logs to riverbanks, where they would float downstream to the sawmills with the coming of spring. Many of the logging sleighs were drawn by oxen due to a shortage of horses at the time. Lumbering was hard, dangerous, and essential work, much of it done by immigrants who were pouring into America in the decades before the Civil War. So it became necessary to provide lumber for homes, stores, churches, schools, and factories for the hundreds of thousands of landless people from Europe, flooding into the United States. It was a period of time when the Industrial Revolution was beginning to take shape in the New World. America was turning more and more to machines, as there were always more jobs than workers to fill them. In the days prior to roads and railways, it was exceedingly difficult to travel from the Atlantic coast states to the Midwest. By 1830, the Erie Canal was completed, providing water transportation between New York's Hudson River to Buffalo on the shores of Lake Erie, where sailing ships carried travelers to the states of Ohio and Michigan. This was the start of the influx of settlers into the Midwestern territories. Before the felling of the trees in this vast forest could begin, it was essential for a woodsman to have an axe, and axes were difficult to come by. A good blacksmith could make but one axe per day, so prospective immigrants would often camp near these blacksmiths for a month or more, waiting for this essential tool. It wasn't until the 1830s that machines began turning out axes by the thousands. Most people came to America to establish farms on land grants from the government. They needed houses, so their first homes were log cabins. As lumber became available, they built conventional houses. It wasn't long before the slow water-powered mills of Michigan were converted to steam, which increased lumber output more than 25 times. The Detroit area became the most important lumbering center during those early years. As Michigan's lumbering industry grew, the eastern seaboard states were exhausting their white pine forest, and by 1860, most of the eastern pine was gone. Michigan lumber began arriving in Buffalo by sailing ship, then by canal boat to the Hudson River. The city of Albany became the largest lumber market in the world. Michigan's white pine lumber was of the highest quality and brought the best prices on both domestic and foreign markets. After skilled craftsmen from Europe began to immigrate, the mechanization of American factories and mills improved immensely. The dominant forces driving the United States up until 1870 were associated with wood and forestry products. The steam-powered sawmills and Michigan's white pine supplied excellent, cheap lumber for world markets. Michigan became the 26th state of the Union in 1837. The population numbered about 87,000. Barely a few thousand people lived on the fringe of the wilderness forest north of Grand Rapids and Port Huron. Lansing was only a township, not even a village, in a dense forest. Chicago had a population of less than 5,000, and Detroit was a thriving town of 8,000. Between 1840 and 1860, government land offices in Detroit, Monroe, Ionia, and Flint made thousands of land sales as people flooded into Michigan in search of cheap farmland. Even railroads got started in spite of politics and controversy over this newfangled method of transportation. Meanwhile, further north, federal land surveyors discovered Michigan's fabulous pine forests, as well as her copper and iron ores. The surveyors estimated the standing pine timber in Michigan to be over 160 billion board feet. A board foot is the unit of measure in the lumber trade, being a board 1 inch thick and 1 foot square. This tremendous volume of timber was enough to completely build 10 million six-room houses. In dollar value, Michigan's green gold outvalued California's yellow gold by more than $1 billion, even at the incredibly low valuation of $13 per thousand board feet at average wholesale prices over the 60-year period from 1837 to 1897. The best of the Michigan pine came from the central portion of the Lower Peninsula. This constituted a super pine belt extending between Lake Michigan and Lake Huron, north of Grand Rapids and Port Huron, northward to a line between Manistee, Houghton Lake, and Oscoda, and later on along the uplands of the larger Upper Peninsula rivers. Michigan was perhaps the most important single part of a great northern forest belt extending from Maine to Minnesota. Such a primeval forest was overwhelming in its vastness, at once forbidding and mysterious, a whole new world of nature quite untouched by man. The virgin timber consisted of hardwoods such as oak, maple, beech, as well as white and Norway pine. The timbermen's treasure was the white pine. Many of these giants were from 120 to 170 feet tall, 2 to 5 feet in diameter at the base, 3/4 of their total height clean and clear without knots. These titans of the forest were known as cork pine, with clear, creamy white wood, light in weight, which made the logs float high on the rivers. This quality of pine was unsurpassed, valuable, and widely sought by timbermen. Less than 20% of Michigan pine could be classified as cork. Most of the pine was from 15 to 30 inches in diameter. The standard government price for land was $1.25 per acre. Huge land grants were made to encourage railroads to penetrate the timber forest and open up the land in undeveloped areas. The first lock on the St. Mary's Rapids opened in 1855. Ships could now reach Lake Superior. The job of selecting choice timberlands was done by men experienced in timber exploration. These men were well paid and known as timber cruisers. They were important explorers who tramped through the forest for weeks at a time. They climbed tall trees, looked around for miles, locating choice stands of white pine, for many a lumberman's status as a future millionaire. The timber cruisers would count the stands of pine trees, estimate their quality, height, and probable board feet. On the basis of their findings, millions of acres of cheap pine lands were acquired by thousands of private timber investors and lumber companies. It wasn't until after the Civil War and the coming of railroads in central and northern Michigan that the lumbering business began to prosper and became Michigan's foremost industry, supplying lumber for both eastern and midwestern markets. Before 1860, most timber, principally hardwood, was harvested in the southern part of Michigan. The lumber was used for local consumption, and at the start of the Civil War, there were about 500 sawmills in operation. Most were small, cutting perhaps as little as 1,000 board feet per day. The mills in operation before the coming of the railroads had to be near a navigable river or stream, as there was no other practical means of getting the lumber to distant markets. From the mills, it was transported by sailing ship on either Lake Michigan or Lake Huron. The principal ports were at Saginaw, Bay City, Port Huron, Oscoda, Alpena, and Sheboygan on the Lake Huron shore, and Grand Haven, Muskegon, Ludington, Manistee, Traverse City, and Petoskey on the Lake Michigan shore. They were all mill towns to a greater or lesser degree. Later on the northern Michigan shore, Menominee, Escanaba, and Manistee were leading mill centers. The greatest mill activity, however, was at the Saginaw, Bay City, Muskegon, Manistee, and Menominee areas. Every day during the months of September and October in the 70s and 80s, trains left Saginaw, Bay City, Muskegon, or Grand Rapids loaded with supplies for lumber camps in the North Woods. Each train carried a coach or two of woodsmen who were then known as shanty boys. They were bound for the woods with a 6 or 7 month season of hard work before them. They were all saying goodbye to civilization. Besides the Native Americans and Indians, there were English, Canadians, Germans, Swedes, French, and Poles, all speaking a different language. The trip northward was a long and tedious one for most of the men. At each station, a few of them got off the train for a long hike to a camp in the distant woods. They carried their few belongings in a clothes bag swung over a shoulder and often walked a distance of 10 to 20 miles to begin the winter's work. By 1880, men had been cutting logs and sawing lumber for some 40 years, long before the railroads penetrated the primeval forest. By 1890, most of Michigan's huge crop of pine trees would be gone. They had taken up to 300 years to grow, but just 50 years to cut them down. A logging camp in the Michigan woods was at best a temporary site to shelter and feed the men and teams of horses during the late fall and winter months in almost complete isolation. The men worked from dawn to sundown, 6 days a week in all kinds of weather. Wages averaged $20 to $25 per month, in line with other wage scales at the time. They were never paid until the breakup of camp in the spring. The sole purpose of every camp was to cut logs and transport them to a nearby riverbank, where they would be transported by the spring floods to mills, where the logs would be sawed into lumber. During the first few decades of commercial logging in Michigan, the volume of operations was small. Most camps consisted of a few rough log buildings to accommodate 25 or 30 men and a few teams of horses. These camps cut from 1.5 to 3 million board feet per season. By the middle 1870s, camps became larger. Some of them accommodated 60 to 100 men and as many as 20 teams of horses, with a season's cut of from 10 to 20 million board feet of lumber. Then, with the advent of the little logging railroads, production doubled and tripled. During the period between 1840 to 1880, lumbering in Michigan emerged from a primitive stage to a highly developed business enterprise. A camp built to accommodate as many as 100 men consisted of 5 or 6 log buildings, usually about 60 by 30 feet in size. The main building had sleeping bunks for the entire crew. Adjoining it, a cook shanty, a barn and stable for 30 or 40 horses, a storage barn for hay and oats, a blacksmith shop where the horses were shod, and a tinker shop where saws and axes were constantly sharpened. In the bunkhouse, the double-deck bunks were fitted with hemlock or cedar boughs, topped with hay or straw. A grain sack filled with straw served as a pillow. There were no springs or mattresses in these lumber camps, and illumination was provided by smoking kerosene lamps. Food was very important in every camp, and the cook could either make or break an otherwise successful operation. It was impossible to attract a good crew of loggers with mediocre food. A crew of 100 men would, in a week's time, consume 6 barrels of flour, 5 or 6 barrels of beef and pork, 8 or 10 bushels of potatoes, 3 or 4 bushels of onions, a barrel of sugar, 5 pounds of tea, 20 pounds of coffee, and 100 pounds of butter and wine. The kitchen chore boy was kept busy chopping wood for the big kitchen stoves or washing towels. It took a lot of towels to dry the dishes, as well as the hands of 100 men. The working day began early. The cooks and teamsters were up by 3:30 to prepare breakfast for the men and feed the horses. After the day's first meal at 5, the men left camp for the daily grind from dawn to dusk. Groups of men known as sawyers and choppers felled the trees and cut them into 16-foot logs. Men known as swampers and skidders then took charge of the sawed logs, dragging them to the nearest logging trail with teams of horses. Before the logs were piled on the riverbanks, the scaler and stamper recorded the board feet, then marked the logs with heavy stamping irons to designate ownership. The men working in the forest were always referred to as woodsmen or shanty boys. The modern term lumberjack is of recent origin and was seldom used in Michigan by the workers themselves. Winter isolation and exclusive male companionship for the better part of 7 months created a multitude of tensions and irritations. Most camps prohibited liquor and card playing. Even talking wasn't allowed in the dining room during meals. Conversation usually led to arguments and then a fist fight. The cook assigned the seats, and the shanty boys always sat in the same place at the long tables. There were no exceptions. If anyone became disorderly, the cook or his flunky quieted him down with an axe handle or perhaps a fry pan. Most every camp had a bully ready to fight at the least provocation. There was a mixture of languages, nationalities, religions, personalities, and temperaments. Men were single, married, farmers, or city ruffians. Many were criminals. An isolated lumber camp was an ideal place for a murderer fleeing from certain jail or worse. Others were just out of jail, seeking a new life. They constituted a common cross-section of the American melting pot. These shanty boys, with their cant hooks, decked logs on the riverbank rollaways, awaiting the spring breakup and the river drive. Early camps used great teams of oxen for skidding the logs out of the forest. Oxen were stronger than horses, slow, dependable, and stupid. Oxen plodded over the skid roads. Unlike horses that would quit when tired, the oxen continued, pulling until they died. When an ox was killed, the carcass was usually dragged back to camp and fed to the crew. These patient animals were easily handled, seldom sick, and ate less, although they were slower than horses. As many as 60 oxen were used in some camps. The man with a whip was known as a bullwhacker. Most white pines were 18 to 30 inches in diameter. However, some were much larger. This butt log measured over 6 feet. A good team of horses was worth $600 or more. That's about 3 times as much as a woodsman received for a winter's work. Horses often received better treatment than the workmen. The hauling sleighs had runners 4 inches wide. Beams between runners were 10 to 14 feet, and the bunks holding the logs up to 12 feet wide held enormous loads. A team of horses pulled the logs up skids by means of a decking chain. Quick skill with a cant hook was required of the top loaders. Icing logging roads was essential for hauling great loads to the riverbank rollaways. A gouger was used to cut ruts in the ice the width of the sleigh runners to prevent the sleigh from leaving the road. Horses drew the barrel from the water hole to fill the tank. The sled roads were prepared while the loggers slept in the shanty. A night crew drove water sprinklers over the roads during the freezing hours, building a slick road that easily skidded the sleighs to the banking grounds at the rivers. Iced roads enabled a team of horses to draw enormous loads, some weighing up to 15 tons, such as this prize load of white pine. Most of the larger timber outfits had a company store where work clothes, shoes, mittens, tobacco, and lumbering necessities could be bought. Loggers wore wool shirts and pants made of heavy, hard-wearing material. The clothing was made water repellent by dipping it into a mixture of water and alum. After it dried, it could be worn in a downpour and kept the logger dry. A logger's life depended on the fit of his boots and the sharpness of the steel caulks that had to be razor sharp to sink into wood. This team of horses drew logs from the cuttings to the skidways, where the logs were then transferred to the hauling sleighs. 5 or 6 teams of horses were often required to pull the great snow plows to clear snow from the hauling roads. This load of pine was decked in Ontonagon country and hauled to the river. Later, it was loaded on flat cars and shipped to the Chicago World's Fair, where it was reloaded on sleighs at the lumberman's exhibit. Despite the fortunes some lumber and timber kings made from their cheaply bought public timberlands, wages continued to be pitifully low. Demands for higher wages were met with stubborn resistance. Troublemakers were placed on blacklists, making it almost impossible to find work as a woodsman. These men cut railroad ties by the piece using one-man saws, axes, and a peeling spud. The winter woods were beautiful, but the work was rugged, the life monotonous, and the hours sun up to sundown, or can see to can't. These men worked with axes, steel wedges, and measuring sticks, knee-deep in the snow. Cutting round 40s was a term used to describe operators who bought one 40-acre piece of land and cut all the surrounding 40-acre plots by trespass. The forests were felled during the late fall and winter months. Thousands of logs laid frozen into the ice and snow along the riverbanks. There were enormous piles of logs at intervals of several miles along the course of the logging streams, waiting for the spring thaws and early floods. Each spring, anxiety plagued the minds of the timber owners. Would the weather play tricks? Would there be enough snow for the drives? There would be no money to pay the bills until the logs reached the sawmills. The river drives on a dozen great logging rivers, such as the Muskegon, Manistee, Osable, Tittabawassee, Menominee, Escanaba, and Manistee, held the power of economic life or death for most lumbermen. From April to September, the main rivers carried their cargo of logs to the mills downstream. Skilled river crews covered their beats along the streams, keeping the logs moving, breaking and preventing jams, retrieving stray logs. In all, getting wet, sleeping and eating in the open, facing danger day in and day out, season after season. If the days were 12 hours long in April, the men worked 12 hours. In June, they were busy for 16 hours, from sunup to sundown. Seldom would a man change wet clothes for dry ones. If he was wet, he'd let the clothes dry on him while he slept. The reason the men worked such long hours was because if the logs got only part way to their destination, they would hang there until the next spring, causing great losses for the timber companies. More than one firm went out of business when the logs failed to reach the mills during the drives. As the logs came near to the mouth of the rivers, they were sorted according to log marks and put into booms or log pens. The booms were enclosed by means of long squared timbers chained together. As logs accumulated in their booms, they were formed into long rafts. Some rafts were held together by many tons of chain, and it wasn't unusual for a logging company to spend as much as $30,000 per year on hemp rope. Since these log rafts had to be delivered to a particular mill further downstream, towing was done by small tugs. Logs were driven to market much like the cattle country trail herds. Like the trail herds, there was always the danger of rustlers. So brands were used on logs to cut down on piracy. Each owner had his own identification mark, hammered into both ends of each log. Michigan log marks probably numbered into the thousands, each distinctive, but some decidedly unusual. Marks consisted of a single letter or initials or devices such as crossed keys, square and compass, perhaps a boot, an animal, a head, or a privy, a horse head, sometimes even an elephant. All identification marks were registered by law in the courthouse of the county where the timber originally stood. One indication of the complex problem of identification faced by sorting men was the fact that many hundreds of different log marks passed through the sorting gaps each season. In 1878, the Tittabawassee River carried some 1,100 different log marks. Timber thieves watched for unguarded logs during the river drives, pulling the choicest specimens ashore, where they cut off the ends and rebranded them. Some of the best logs were often stolen and rebranded so many times that a 16-foot log arrived at the sawmill just 12 feet long. Even as late as 1887, the logging rivers of lower Michigan carried over 2 billion logs to the mills. The Muskegon River was number 1 in volume that year, with 582 million logs. The Tittabawassee was second, carrying 356 million. It wasn't until the late 1870s that a transportation revolution struck the Great Lakes lumbering region. This revolution permitted year-round logging, summer as well as winter, without dependence upon snow and ice alone. The giant white pines fell with shattering force as new methods speeded up the tempo of destruction. Vast areas of untouched timber, 5 to 10 miles or more back from a logging stream, were opened up to systematic cutting. All this was made possible by a young logger named Winfield Garish, who saw a new type of railroad engine while attending the Great Centennial Exposition of 1876 in Philadelphia. He was fascinated by a small locomotive which would prove to be the answer to the logger's dream of a more dependable device than a sleigh for hauling logs. The year before, Garish had experienced a lack of sufficient water to float the logs in a small stream, which caused numerous delays and setbacks. He realized the little iron horse could get the timber to market without dependence on snow. So he formed a company with 6 stockholders, and in October 1876, the enterprise was begun amid the boos and jeers from other loggers who thought the venture was a foolish undertaking. Few loggers considered it worthwhile to seek a year-round method of transporting logs to the riverbanks. During the first season of operation, the little Lake George and Muskegon River Railroad, with 2 small locomotives and 50 logging cars, carried over 11,000 tons of logs at the rate of 500,000 board feet per day, and became the first successful logging railroad in the United States. While other loggers were struggling with the worst sleighing conditions in a decade, the little Garish line alone succeeded in putting most of the logs that were banked into the Muskegon River that season. The brilliant success of the tiny Lake George Railroad created a sensation in the lumbering trade. By 1879, the line carried 114 million board feet of logs, and by 1882, there were 32 of these narrow-gauge logging railroads constructed in Michigan, and by 1889, there were 89 logging railroads in operation, totaling 450 miles of track. They were a spectacular success, and a new era had begun. Another phase of the transportation revolution, as applied to the lumber industry, was the building of regular-style standard railroads. The Pierre Marquette took 12 years, 1862 to 1874, to span the distance from Saginaw on Lake Huron to Ludington on Lake Michigan. The stations along the line were supply depots for the logging camps. They soon became thriving villages, possessing sawmills, shingle mills, and small factories using forest products. The railroads began to haul logs and lumber, as well as other supplies. The big logging operators increased the annual log output by 10 times their former rate. Firms that had cut 5 million feet were now cutting 50 to 100 million feet per season. Such operations required immense holdings of timber, 8 or 10 camps, 30 or 40 miles of logging railroad, several trains, and perhaps as many as 400 well-housed, well-fed, and well-organized men. Loggers and lumbermen working in Michigan forests turned out an incredible amount of lumber in the 60-year period from 1840 to 1900. 161 billion board feet of pine and about 50 billion of cedar, hemlock, and a variety of hardwoods. Hemlock bark created a major industry in itself. The bark was used in the tanning of leather. Roughly 1 billion saw logs were transported to the mills, sawed into lumber, and shipped to wholesale markets, principally Albany and Chicago. Long before Michigan pine was cut in commercial quantity, sawmills were well established in Michigan. In 1837, the year Michigan became a state, 435 sawmills were doing business in the lower 4 tiers of counties. These were local mills cutting hardwood and only occasionally a little pine. By 1873, there were more than 1,600 mills north of a line from Port Huron to Grand Haven. The peak output occurred in the early 1880s. Saginaw mills produced nearly 1,100 million feet in 1883, while Muskegon mills cut over 700 million board feet of lumber. Pioneer mills cut only small amounts of lumber each day. About 95% of the mills before the coming of the railroads were near the mouth of a navigable river. The greatest centers of mill activity were the Saginaw and Bay City area, Muskegon, Manistee, and Menominee. Great technological improvement in the mill saws created another revolution in lumber production. During the 30-year period from about 1850 to 1880, the pit or whip saws, the sash and upright saws became obsolete as they were replaced by the more efficient gang and circular saws. The gang saws became the giants of the mills. These monsters could cut up to 3 logs simultaneously into fully cut boards. The circular saws soon followed, taking a favored position along with the gang saws as the mainstay of the sawmills. Dozens of Michigan sawmills burned to the ground during the second half of the 19th century. Sparks from the wood fires in the steam plants powering the mills would often ignite the huge quantities of sawdust before it could be disposed of. Usually, there were barrels of water stored on the roofs of sawmills to offer some protection against fire. Even at the peak period of lumber production in Michigan, half the mills were relatively small. The John McGraw Mill at the upper end of Bay City covered over 200 acres and is believed to have been the largest in the world. It cut more than 40 million feet of lumber per season, working 12 hours per day. By the 1880s, fully mechanized mill equipment was widely used by companies producing above 20 or 30 million feet per season. Bigness, however, was not the dominant factor. For every big mill, there were 20 average-sized mills cutting 10 million and 30 or 40 small firms averaging 5 million feet per year. In later years, these mills sawed more hemlock, cedar, and hardwoods than they did pine. Even before the 1890s began, mills along the Huron shore from Saginaw to Sheboygan faced a grave problem of declining quality and quantity of logs with the rapid depletion of the log supply. Lumber dealers from Chicago to Albany complained of the increasing poor quality of Michigan pine. Many firms moved operations into the south using southern yellow pine or into Minnesota, some to the west coast. Many mills just shut down for good, Others bought timberlands in Canada around Georgian Bay, and by means of huge rafting operations were able to supply their mills for several years more. The golden age of Michigan pine was coming to a close at the turn of the century. In its wake came a rapid decline of the prosperity which had sustained Michigan for half a century. Everywhere across the countryside there remained vast areas of cut-over land, dotted by ugly pine stumps, the scars of forest fires, and barren sand wastes, sagging farmhouses, abandoned homesteads, ghost towns, and abandoned hopes and dreams. As we near the 21st century, the hills and plains of the once cut-over acres no longer appear as desolate as they were 100 years ago, as new forests had become more plentiful. Half of the land area of Michigan today is still classified as forest, nearly 20 million acres, 2/3 of which is privately owned. And even though the hundreds of mills, many in the Upper Peninsula, no longer specialize in white pine, Michigan's annual sawmill cut totals an impressive 500 to 700 million board feet, largely pulpwood for paper mills and fuel wood. The loggers made a thorough job of removing Michigan's white pine. The majority of the trees were mature, and the wood was an essential element in the rapidly expanding nation and the cleared land necessary for the expanding population. Lumber has always been important to Americans. Homes, housing, bridges, businesses, railroads, and industry used prodigious quantities of wood and wood products. Lumbering is probably the oldest business in America. Although many deplore the cutting methods of the early loggers, it was actually a sound practice to log the area off before the forest fell prey to disease, fires, and insects. Even today, with great advances in forest protection, fires, insects, and disease still take a toll of thousands of trees each year. Much of lower Michigan's forests were destroyed by settlers clearing the land to produce food for the growing population. Farmers often burned the big, beautiful monarchs. To them, the trees were worthless obstacles which had to be removed so they could raise a few potatoes, some wheat, oats, and barley. These vast stands of timber are often referred to as virgin forest, but there were no virgin forest in the strictest sense. Surely unlimited stands of trees grew to maturity and disappeared countless times in silent death long before man ever set eyes on the North American continent.